The call came through at 11:42 on a Tuesday morning in February 1994. Not from Langley. From a number you didn't recognize. You let it go to voicemail. You were in the middle of a debrief with an asset who'd been feeding you information on arms shipments through the Czech corridor for the past 8 months. The kind of intelligence that keeps entire operations alive. The kind that gets people killed if it lands in the wrong hands. The phone vibrated again. Same number. You excused yourself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. They used your real name, not your cover, not your operational alias. Your actual name. The one that was supposed to exist only in a file cabinet 3 floors underground at headquarters. And then they said something that made your stomach drop. They knew about the asset you were meeting right now. They knew the apartment number. They knew what car you drove. You hung up. You walked back into the room. Your asset, David, was pouring coffee, his back turned. You've been in this system 9 years. You know how it's designed to work. You know your operation. You know your assets. You know your handler. You don't know what the Desk 3 rouseover is working on. You don't know who else has access to the same source reporting you're reading. You're given exactly enough information to do your job and not one shred more. This isn't paranoia. It's design. Because the moment someone inside the system decides to betray it, compartmentalization is supposed to limit the damage. One officer, one operation, one blown network. Containable. Survivable. Except when the person who betrays you has access to everything. Aldrich Ames sits 3 rows over from you. You've worked in the same building for years. You've passed him in the hallway. Nodded at him in meetings. He's a 31-year veteran. A counterintelligence officer, the kind of person whose job is to catch traitors. And for 9 years, while you've both sat in those same meetings about protecting sources and methods, he's been selling every name, every operation, every carefully constructed cover to the KGB. Including yours. The Russians gave him the code name Kolokol. The bell. Because every time he spoke, someone died. When investigators finally went back through the files, the number was almost unbelievable. 55 operations. Imagine a third of every safe house, every informant, every carefully placed contact the CIA spent the Cold War building, gone in a single afternoon when a file folder changed hands in a car parked 2 blocks from the Soviet embassy. Not just American. A British asset in Warsaw who'd been feeding information for 6 years. French networks. German contacts. All of them. At least 10 executions. 10 people who believed that the information they risked their lives to pass on would be protected. That the system they were trusting had mechanisms in place to keep them safe. Their names are on record. General Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet Army intelligence official who had been feeding information to the West for over 20 years. Sergei Motorin. Valery Martinov. Names that most people will never hear, because the work they did will never be declassified. And the worst part? The agency knew something was wrong years before they caught him. Operations were failing. Sources were going silent. In 1985 alone, the CIA lost contact with multiple high-value assets in the Soviet Union within weeks of each other. The kind of coincidence that doesn't happen by accident. Someone inside headquarters started asking questions. Pulling case files. Looking for patterns. But Ames had access to the same internal investigations that were supposed to catch him. He knew what red flags the mole hunters were looking for, because he was reading their reports. And every time they got close, he adjusted. He buried the connections. He muddied the trail. And Ames? He was still sitting in those very meetings. Now imagine you've caught Ames. You think the nightmare is over. You've found them all. The bleeding stops here. It doesn't. Because catching one traitor doesn't end the damage. It starts a different kind of destruction. And you, the officer who just closed the case, are about to watch your own agency turn on itself. The thing about mole hunts is that they don't just destroy the guilty. They destroy everyone. When James Angleton pulled Serge Carlo into a windowless room in 1964, Carlo had no idea his career was already over. He was a respected officer. 20 years with the agency. And Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence chief, was convinced Carlo was a Soviet mole. The accusation started in 1961, when a KGB officer named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the West. He told the CIA that the Soviet Union had placed a high-ranking mole inside the agency. He didn't know who. He couldn't give a name. But he was certain the mole existed. Angleton believed him. And for the next 15 years, he conducted an internal witch hunt that wrecked at least a dozen careers. Officers were pulled from the field. Promotions were blocked. Operatives who had spent their entire professional lives building trust networks overseas were suddenly under suspicion because they knew a Russian contact, or because they'd traveled to Eastern Europe at the wrong time, or because someone Golitsyn vaguely remembered seeing at a conference bore a passing resemblance to them. Serge Carlo was one of the most prominent victims. A respected officer. No evidence against him. Just suspicion. And that was enough to end his career. The mole Golitsyn was convinced existed? Never definitively found. Some analysts believe Golitsyn himself was a double agent sent to create exactly this kind of chaos, to make the CIA turn on itself while real Soviet operatives continued their work undetected. The same thing happened at the FBI. A KGB asset named Alexei Kulak, codename Fedora, told his handlers that there was a mole inside the bureau. The FBI launched an internal investigation that lasted years. Careers were destroyed. Operations were frozen. And by the time they realized Kulak's information might have been deliberate disinformation, the damage was done. Whether Kulak was a genuine asset or a plant is still disputed. But the result is clear: the KGB didn't need to destroy the FBI's counterintelligence apparatus. They just needed to convince the FBI to destroy it themselves. And honestly, that's the part one keep coming back to. Not the names, not the executions. The idea that the most effective weapon in play wasn't a gun at all. It was a rumor, carefully placed, and then left to grow. Which meant the agency going into 1994 wasn't just hunting a mole. It was hunting itself. And that made what happened next almost inevitable. 9 years. That's what you keep coming back to. Not the executions. The 9 years. And the answer isn't that he was brilliant. Ames drove a Jaguar. Parked in the same spot every morning, always within 2 spaces of the entrance. He paid cash for a house worth $500,000, 15 times his annual salary. He went on European vacations that cost more than most people earn in a year. His colleagues noticed. Some of them even joked about it, wondering out loud where Rick was getting his money. You were in the break room when someone made that joke. You laughed. But no one reported it. Because he was one of them. He had a badge. He had clearance. He'd been with the agency for 3 decades. And the idea that someone like that could be selling secrets to Moscow was too uncomfortable to seriously consider. This is the same dynamic that protected Robert Hanssen at the FBI for over 20 years. Hanssen attended the same parties as other intelligence officers. He sat in the same meetings. He had access to some of the most sensitive counterintelligence files in the US government. And the entire time, he was passing information to the Russians. No one suspected him because people don't want to believe that someone they work alongside, someone they trust, is capable of that kind of betrayal. It wasn't until a CIA analyst named Sandra Grimes noticed something mundane, a series of financial discrepancies in Ames's bank records, that the case finally broke. Not through some brilliant counterintelligence operation. Through bookkeeping. Ames had been depositing unexplained sums into accounts that didn't match his salary. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Over years. And no one had noticed because no one was looking at the boring, administrative side of the investigation. They were chasing ghosts in Moscow. The real answer was in a spreadsheet. The Iran-Contra affair exposed a different kind of institutional failure. CIA Director William Casey pushed the agency's Directorate of Operations to rely on assets they couldn't monitor. Operatives the CIA itself didn't trust. And those operatives enabled the diversion of arms sale profits to fund an illegal war in Nicaragua. The investigative report was clear: Casey was largely responsible for creating the conditions that allowed the scandal to happen. Not through malice. Through recklessness. Through a willingness to cut corners when the mission seemed more important than the safeguards. And the agency learned. After Iran-Contra, Congress mandated the appointment of a statutory inspector general, someone whose job was to investigate the CIA itself. Frederick P. Hitz was the first person to hold that role, appointed by President George H.W. Bush in 1989. But institutional reform doesn't undo the past. And it doesn't guarantee the future. On December 30, 2009, you watched a man walk onto Forward Operating Base Chapman in Khost, Afghanistan. He was supposed to be an asset. A source. Someone who had been feeding intelligence to the CIA and Jordanian intelligence for months. He wasn't. He was a triple agent. And when he detonated a suicide bomb in the middle of the base, he killed 7 CIA officers and 1 Jordanian intelligence officer in a single explosion. It was described as Al-Qaeda's greatest single strike against the CIA. Not a drone strike. Not a battlefield ambush. A betrayal. By someone the agency had trusted enough to bring onto a secure military base. The officers who died weren't sitting behind desks in Virginia. They were forward deployed. Running operations. Collecting intelligence that shaped strikes against terrorist networks. The kind of people who put themselves in danger because they believed the sources they were meeting had been properly vetted. And the source hadn't been. The investigations afterward found the same pattern that's appeared in every major intelligence failure: a compartmentalization worked too well. You, on the ground, didn't have access to all the reporting on your asset. The analysts back at Langley who had doubts about the source's reliability didn't communicate those doubts clearly enough. And the pressure to produce results, to get actionable intelligence fast, overrode the caution that should have stopped the meeting from happening. No one person made a catastrophic error. The system just allowed it. The way systems do when institutional pressure to succeed becomes stronger than the protocols designed to prevent disaster. If you want to understand how institutions protect themselves, look at Project MKUltra. Between 1953 and 1973, the CIA conducted human experimentation aimed at developing interrogation techniques. They administered high doses of LSD. They used electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, on subjects who did not consent, who often didn't even know they were part of an experiment. Some of those subjects were prisoners. Some were psychiatric patients. Some were just people the CIA decided were acceptable losses in the pursuit of a technique that might give American intelligence an edge over the Soviets. The program was classified for decades. When parts of it were finally exposed in the 1970s, the CIA destroyed most of the records. What we know comes from the files that survived, and from the testimonies of people who were subjected to treatments that destroyed their mental health, their relationships, their ability to function. No one was held accountable in a way that mattered. Some officials testified before Congress. Some programs were officially shut down. But the institutional logic that allowed MKUltra to exist in the first place, the belief that national security justifies almost any method, never fully went away. It just became more carefully hidden. You're back in that hallway. Your phone is still in your hand. David is still in the other room, waiting for you to return. You have 2 choices. The first, you assume the call was a bluff. A psychological operation designed to make you doubt your own network. You go back in. You finish the debrief. You file your report the way you always do. And if the system is working the way it's supposed to, your asset stays safe and the intelligence gets used. The second, you assume the call was real. Someone inside your own organization has access to operational details they shouldn't have. And if you file that report, you're handing them everything they need to burn your entire network. But here's the part no one tells you when you join, and there is no way to know which choice is correct until it's too late. Because if the system itself is compromised, every protocol you follow could be the thing that gets someone killed. And if the system is fine and you start operating outside it, you become the problem. The rogue element. The person who doesn't trust their own side. Sandra Grimes caught Aldrich Ames because she was willing to look at her own colleagues as potential threats. That skepticism saved lives. But it also destroyed the careers of people who were investigated and cleared, people whose reputations never fully recovered, even after they were exonerated. James Jesus Angleton's mole hunt wrecked the CIA's Soviet operations for over a decade. He was trying to protect the agency. And in doing so, he did more damage than some of the actual spies he was hunting. The question you have to answer, standing in that hallway, isn't whether betrayal is possible. You already know it is. Ames proved it. Hanssen proved it. The Coast bombing proved it. The question is how you do your job when you can't be certain the person sitting 3 desks over isn't the one who's going to get you killed. You put the phone back in your pocket. You walk back into the room. David looks up from the table. He asks if everything's okay. His coffee sits untouched in front of him, still steaming, the same cup he poured before you stepped out. You tell him it is. And you make a decision, not because you're certain it's right, but because in this work, certainty is a luxury no one actually has. You operate in the space between trust and paranoia. You build networks knowing they can be compromised. You follow protocols knowing they can fail. And sometimes, someone on your side sells you out. Not because the system was broken, but because the system was built by people. And people, given the right pressure, the right incentive, the right moment of weakness, will betray anything. The architects of intelligence agencies understood this from the beginning. That's why compartmentalization exists. That's why mole hunts exist. That's why every major espionage failure is followed by an investigation that promises reform. But reform doesn't change the fundamental truth: in a world built on secrecy, the person you trust the most has access to everything you need to protect. And if they decide to use that access against you, the only thing standing between you and catastrophe is luck. Aldrich Ames sold 55 operations over 9 years. He attended meetings about counterintelligence while actively committing espionage. He sat across from colleagues who trusted him, and he smiled, and he took notes, and he went home and packaged everything they'd told him into a file for the KGB. He wasn't an anomaly. He was a reminder. The system will always have gaps. The question is whether you see them before someone else does. The call you received in that hallway? It might have been real. It might have been a test. It might have been someone trying to see if you'd break protocol, if you'd go rogue, if you'd become the very problem you were trained to detect. And David, the one you've trusted for 8 months, might walk out of that building safely tonight. Or he might not. That's the part no one tells you when you sign up. You don't get closure. You don't get proof. You get aftermath. And sometimes, years later, you find out the person you trusted was working for the other side the entire time. So the question you're left with, standing in that hallway with your phone in your hand, isn't whether the system can be trusted. It's whether the person on your side of the table right now, the one with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that's gone cold, is still the person you think he is. And somewhere, in an office you've never seen, someone else is already making a call.